Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Heal with Kat podcast. My name is Kat. I am your host, and I'm so grateful to welcome you back to another episode on the channel here. And today we are talking about grief and resilience in grief. And my guest today, Dr. Lynn Banis, is a grief and resilience mentor. She spent 30 years in the executive coaching world, went through a loss of her mother, her brother, and her husband in the span of 2 years, and used all of her incredible knowledge of 30 years of executive coaching and counseling and created a grief program that she calls Different from All the Rest. And she's going to tell you why in the episode today. Now, many of you know that I've opened up in the last few months about the loss of my brother-in-law and the kind of psychological chaos that goes on with a traumatic loss and grief. And I was very humbled in my experience with grief of realizing that I don't know it all when it comes to grief. And I don't think anyone really understands grief until they go through it. We can always be students of life. We can be a lifelong learner. Really, in this episode, I really just wanted to ask Dr. Lynn a lot of questions when it came to what it's like to support someone who's grieving and what it's like to be the person grieving the loss. And her approach is quite unique. And we talk a lot about neurology and brain mapping and memory reconstruction and actionable steps that you can take if you're grieving the loss of someone and so much more. So open hearts, open mind to this week's episode. Send us to somebody who is grieving or who could benefit from hearing these words and this message that Dr. Lynn has for us on the podcast this week. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and review the episode. Screenshot it and send it to me on Instagram, as I'm still giving away a free ancestral chakra reading on the last day of every month. All you got to do is screenshot it and send it to me, and I will give it away and announce it on Instagram at the end of the month. With that, guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for always being so supportive of the work that we're doing here. My biggest and most heart-centered hope is that this is supportive for you or somebody that you know and helps brighten their day just a little bit more. Life has been a little crazy these days, and we need a little bit of light, and hopefully the podcast can bring that to your life today. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Everyone, we have Dr. Lynn, is it Banis?
Banis, that's right.
Banis, yeah, on the podcast today to talk us through grief and the all-encompassing knowledge that we need to know about how to navigate grief, which is such a sensitive topic. Welcome to the Heal with Kat podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
You know, your story really and your work really touched me when I saw your podcast or your profile rather on Podmatch. It came at a time where my family and my sister, we were grieving the loss of my brother-in-law. He died back in August. And, you know, I had never really understood grief in a way that hit home so deeply. You know, you hear people that are kind of on the outskirts of your life, they pass. Or, you know, my grandparents passed, they were older. My aunt, she passed from breast cancer, but nothing really was so deep like the shock of a death that comes out of nowhere.
Yes.
So I'm so intrigued to hear about your wisdom when it comes to grief. And I know that you've spent so much time on this topic. So before we dive into all my questions, I would love for you to share your story with your life and with grief as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad to. I had a very wonderful, normal upbringing in a beautiful little town where everybody knew each other pretty much. And I went off to college thinking I would be a pipe organ major, and decided that I couldn't understand how people could want to practice instead of going to Big Ten football games. So I figured maybe that wasn't for me. And so I transferred to a smaller school than the University of Michigan. And I ended up being a teacher for 5 or 7 years or so. And then I raised my family. Then I went back and got a master's and then a doctorate because I was thinking at the time that I'd like to be a university professor. And I fell in love with industrial organizational psychology, human behavior, growth, and leadership development. So I ended up going that route. And I ran the training departments for 2 children's hospitals and a big full service hospital. I think there were about 8 or 9 subsidiaries. It was a big hospital. And then my husband got the chance to go to Chicago to work at Northwestern University. And I landed a job with one of the big 6 consulting firms. And it was just, I loved it. I thought it was what I was preparing for all my life. And I just had the opportunity to go all over the world and work with partners and their partnerships and other, the clients. And we did a lot of leadership development. I also did executive coaching. And so I have 30 some years as an executive coach under my belt. So that was quite a while. And then my husband retired and I kept doing a little bit because I had my own company and I also was part owner in a coach training school. And then I decided I'd retire too. And we had my 100-year-old mother come to live with us. And she lived until she was 106.
Oh my gosh.
And, that kind of a passing it's horrible, but you do expect it, especially at that age.
Yeah.
But she was fantastic until she fell and really, broke 18 ribs in her femur in 2 places. So at that age, you don't recover, Yeah. So then, about a year and a half later, I got a phone call in the middle of the night, and my nephew told me that my little brother died all of a sudden from a massive heart attack. And then within a year, my husband died unexpectedly. So triple whammy, right? All within about 2.5 years. And so I've not only experienced the deep grief of a husband, a spouse, but the compound grief of 3 people pretty quickly, pretty close together. And so I learned a tremendous amount, obviously. I was devastated at first. Wasn't supposed to happen, of course. Eventually, after I'd gotten through the worst part of it, I began thinking, I just don't want to stay where I am. I don't want the rest of my life to be like this. And so I started thinking about my skills and what I had learned, what I'd done, the tools I had. And I thought, well, doggone it. I don't care how old I am. And you can see I'm not a spring chicken. I'm going to start a business and I'm going to help people through this because I don't believe anybody should have to go through it alone. And so many people do, and believe that they can't bother anybody and don't realize that they're not a bother. They just need to train the person how to deal with death. And that's something that I try to do on both sides. I try to help grieving people understand what they need to say to have the right response. And then I try to do talks and stuff for the rest of us who don't usually know what to do or say or how to act and often blow it, even when we're trying. It's so hard not to hurt somebody's feelings that we do anyway. So it's really an important piece, I think, because our society just does not handle grief. There's just a big taboo about even talking about it.
Well, I think grief feels really messy. And in our society, being messy is shameful for some reason, having messy emotions or letting a process be messy. I think it kind of speaks to the hyper individualism that we have in our society because tribalism says, hey, you're mess. We're here to support you.
That's right.
But in our society, we don't have that. And I do think that many times in grief, you see a lot of separation with families.
You do.
And I love that you really normalize this because when you're watching someone going through something traumatic, you're only pulling from your experience.
That's right.
You don't know. For me, I didn't know how many questions to ask. Was I asking too many questions? What was my role? How was I? And so I would love to understand what you learned through all of your years in executive coaching, what you learned in terms of connection with people and asking the right questions and like really getting into more of an emotional, intimate relationship with someone that bleeds into grief.
Yeah, absolutely. Somehow our society, we feel like we have to talk. We have to say something. And, we're uncomfortable when there's a lull. If you want somebody to start talking to you, create a lull and they'll fill it.
So true. I'm guilty of that.
I know we all are. We all are. And so I think that what we need to do is get more comfortable with just being with someone, accepting wherever they are. And, some of the things that traditionally or very often are said are very hurtful. And if my husband died last night, I don't want to hear that he's in a better place. Even that might be somebody's belief and I honor that. That's fine. But don't tell a newly widowed person because they're grieving that loss, that particular loss, and all they want is the person back. So that's not a helpful thing at that point. And so I think that we need to all learn that Focus on the individual that's grieving. Do ask them how they're doing. Ask it in such a way that you may also say, I really care. I really want you to feel comfortable talking to me. And I know that might not be today, but I'm going to touch base with you periodically, and I'll just come and sit with you if that's what you want. Because really, that's more powerful than almost anything. You can't fix the grieving person, and we tend to want to fix people. So, don't do that, and don't fill the air with platitudes, because a lot of them are hurtful, like the one I just mentioned. You're much better off just sitting with someone, and you always laugh about this. I got so many 9 by 13 pans of lasagna that I'm begging people, don't take them lasagna. And if it's one person, don't take them that much. They will never eat it all. Be thoughtful about that. It's one person who has no appetite. Now, if they have a family, yes, you can feed the family because they're going to be a little bit different, and the children will eat, so that needs to be handled. But think of the things that are easy for you to supply that would be helpful and easy for the grieving person. So maybe it's a fruit tray that they don't have to cook anything, and cheese and crackers and stuff that they might nibble on, because they're probably not going to want a full meal, at least in the very beginning. But the problem is that after a couple of weeks, all of that stops coming. The visits stop, and you really enter that terribly lonely, hurtful place. So that's why I say, just go and sit with somebody. Watch the football game together. Just be there. That's all they need, is someone there, a presence.
Yeah, because they've lost such a presence in their lives.
Yes.
How did you get through your grief, when the casseroles stopped coming around, and when you went through that process of really entering, like you said, that darkness? What was your process like? What did you find worked best for you?
Well, I'm fortunate. I have 3 daughters who have been incredible, and we grieved together, and we brought the family in and the children, and tried to help the children understand it's okay to cry. This is sad, but we're all right. We're going to be fine. And I think that was so nourishing, because there were lots of hugs, crying in each other's arms, it's okay. It's okay. But we did also manage to turn that into times of sharing of the fun and the joy and the silliness and that sort of thing. So we started reminiscing. And I remember that doing that when my father died too, with my brothers. It really was so soothing, to be able to smile and even giggle in that time. So, that was the first thing. And then I got myself very, very busy, and I don't recommend that for everybody. I would, that was one of the learnings that I had, I thought was probably a mistake, because I just got so busy that I didn't fully deal with the grief, which is pretty typical. It hurts so much that you want to get away from it. So I do urge people to find a group, and those early grief groups are fine unless you stay to the point where they become a wallowing poor me pool. And at that point, you need to get out of there, because that's not moving forward. But in the beginning, it's okay to hear someone else's story, and you don't feel like you're so alone, because you'll hear widows and widowers say, well, nobody understands this unless they've been through it. There's no way you can understand it. And that's pretty true. Nobody goes through that kind of hurt. What I learned clearly, because I had a lot of brain fog for a year, you just can't think. You don't want to make decisions, because you might be sorry that you made that decision without being able to think clearly. And so I found that I was able, and I know I have this background that not everybody has, I was able to start thinking about, well, what do I know that I can apply to help me move? Because I don't want to stay here. This is just too painful. So I started using my skills on myself, and that was good, because I have come up with a process that I know helps, and I know will move people to the place where, we work through things like self-limiting beliefs and mindset and, all the things intellectually and neurologically that we need to do so that we can get to the place where we can accept and realize it can be different. And that is, I'll tell you, that's the most rewarding thing for me to see, is when that light goes off for somebody, and you can it's tangible. You can see the weight lifting off of them, and they're able to breathe again. There's a tad bit of freedom there. And then from that point, we can move on in probably a little bit faster fashion because they're starting to think about, okay, now who am I? What do I want to do? What's important to me? So I think that that's probably one of the big things for me, was being able to be the guinea pig for myself.
Tell us about this system that you have. I would also love to hear about the 5 stages of grief, because I didn't ever know about that until, we went through what we went through. And then I thought, oh gosh, sometimes I feel like the 5 stages of grief, you're bouncing around between all of them at times.
Yes, it's not iterative. There is not a straight line. And that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. And it's been debunked quite a bit fairly recently, because that was considered a linear thing, and it's not. Everybody goes through at their own pace and processes things differently. Our brains work differently, each one of us. And so, you might go into that disbelief, just not believing that something happened. And then, you might move to a little bit of acceptance, and then you might go all the way back to the beginning. and it's okay. It's just what your body is doing and needs to do. And your brain, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the minute you experience a trauma like that, your brain starts to rewire itself, because its job is to keep you safe. And it creates like maps in your head that are, okay, this person is always here, and this is where the kitchen is, and this and this and this. And so, think of it as a reason that you can get up in the middle of the night and not crash into every piece of furniture that you have, because there is a map in there. Okay, so the brain all of a sudden says, wait a minute, that person isn't here. Wait a minute, there's a big gap. And it starts trying to readjust so it can keep you safe. And that takes a long time. And then when we start working through the grief, it still takes time, because it's adjusting. And, even when I get people after they've gone through most of that brain fog and the emotional stuff, we still do some brain rewiring, because I want to make sure somebody is comfortably in their new chosen place, and that it's a good fit for them, and that they will continue to grow and be fulfilled and happy. Yeah. So, my process is working through our beliefs and challenging those self-limiting beliefs and helping people replace them with something that's more purposeful and supports them moving forward. Changing beliefs isn't always the easiest thing. It might take a while for us to figure out what they want to believe. I mean, we have a choice. And then, we do mindset work, and I do a life study where I am able to pick out what people are like when they're in flow. So I identify what they're doing when they're in that place where they're just at their best. And I also help them identify what's the environment, what needs to be in your environment to support you. And I think that's a piece other people don't know about. So then we start working on what is your new identity, and what do you want to do? Who do you want to be? I take all of the information and help them understand what I would call best fit. If you want to do that, then we have to make sure this is in the environment and that's in the environment, because that's what makes us absolutely crazy and feeling out of control, is when we don't have a good fit. If you have this is you and this is your job, for instance, and the fit is like this, you're not going to feel very much in control. So the closer you can get it, you're never going to get it perfect, but the closer you can get it, the more comfortable you're going to be, and the more productive you're going to be, and the happier you're going to be. So, I want to do that with people as they redesign their lives, because I think it's just the way it should be. We all deserve a life we can love.
Absolutely. And especially after grief, I think a lot of those things start feeling impossible or hopeless.
Yes.
I'm really curious, what are some limiting beliefs that people have when they're processing grief through a traumatic loss like death?
What will other people think of me? I can't move forward because people will think I didn't love him or her. I don't want to leave them behind, which I don't allow them to do that. We take all of that forward and honor it. I can't do this by myself. Life will never be positive. Just on and on and on. And the fears, I don't have enough money. What if I run out of money? What if? All of those things, come piling in. And in a kind of a jumbled mix a lot of times. So it all has to be teased out and addressed so that their mind is ready to move forward too. Because you can't start doing something if your mind's back here, because you're not going to get very far. You're going to fall back into I can't do this.
Do you believe that there's a certain amount of time that it takes to grieve the loss of a loved one? Or do you believe that with the right amount of effort and energy and intention, you can do a year's worth of work in 6 months? Like, what is the timeline like when it comes to grief? Hey everyone, it's Kat popping in during the episode today to tell you about my free cycle breaker quiz. Do you ever feel like you're the black sheep of your family, or maybe you find yourself stuck in the same family patterns or dynamics over and over again with no relief? Well, what if I told you you could transform that role into something really, really powerful? When you take my cycle breaker quiz, I help you understand the childhood coping tools that are showing up in your adult life today. And by understanding how you show up with your family and the role you play, this can be the portal into understanding the patterns of your lineage. Ready to embrace your role? Go to catdow.com/cycle breaker to take the quiz, or visit the link in the show notes below. Your transformation from black sheep to cycle breaker starts right now.
Yeah, timelines are different, and everybody is different. It's kind of a readiness thing, like with kids getting ready to read. This child isn't going to read till they're 5. That one's reading at 3 because they were ready. But, there is that piece too to think about is this person in a place where they are ready to move forward without all sorts of stuff blocking them? And usually it's no, we need to get rid of the blocks. And then they can move forward more quickly. But it's individual. And what I find is there's about a year passes before someone begins to feel a little bit like themselves again, and they can function. They're not, they can manage their emotions. Not that there aren't times when you get bowled over by, a wave of grief, but you can handle it, and if you cry, you're not feeling like you're doing something wrong and you're annoying people and all of those sorts of things. But one interesting thing I have found is that it seems like the second year is more difficult. There's not the deep emotional pain, but there is this realization that, no, this is real. It's not going to change. And that can be used as a motivator to help people get out of the spot that they're in. But a lot of people can fall backwards if they don't have the kind of support that they need.
Yeah. I would imagine that grief is a lot of stop and go, a lot of holding space for the messy emotions, and then a little bit moving forward, and then kind of, and that feels really unstable in a time where the grief is already unstable. I thought that grief looked a certain way. And I learned it really doesn't. What I learned is as a chronic fixer and people pleaser, I had to get out of my own ego and my own head and realize that I wanted to do what I thought was best. But really, if I was truly in the mindset to think about things from the heart, it would have been about just doing whatever was needed to be done to support. And, I just love, again, I'm just bringing this full circle, but I love that you touched on this idea that grief is not linear, and many times we don't have the tools to navigate the grief. And I guess my follow-up question to that is, what are your thoughts on expectations in grief? Do you deal with that a lot too?
Oh, yes. And family can make it really messy.
Yeah. Yeah. Unintentionally, maybe sometimes.
Yeah. Well, but it goes from them thinking, Mom, you're moving too fast, or you're not moving fast enough. You need to go out. You need to do this. You need to do that, to people getting in fights over things, and money. And so it's huge. And so that's one reason that, the person who does what I do really helps an individual set boundaries and understand how to say no, and really work on thinking through things, starting with what do I want or what do I need? Because especially if it's a spouse, everyone has given up part of themselves to become a partner. And I sometimes tell the story that I was pouring a second cup of coffee one morning and looked and noticed the sink. There was 1 cup of coffee in there, 1 cup. And up until this time, for 35 years, there'd been 2. And I thought, you know what? I'm not only grieving the loss of him not being here, but I also have lost who I was when he was here.
Wow.
And the more I thought about it, the more I thought I always made decisions for us to the point where I don't even know what I want anymore. What do I want? And if you're a wife and a mother, you've put yourself second.
Oh, yeah.
For many, many, many years. I mean, but even if it's young people, you've put yourself second. And I think sometimes you do it more early on than you do later on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. New systems, new dynamics,
Yeah.
The creation of a family is a lot of change for people
Yes,
too,
it
I
is.
think.
It
Yeah.
is. It is.
How do you feel that this program you've created to support people through their grief is different from other ones out there? You mentioned kind of the wallowing of support groups. I'm imagining that your programs are more one-on-one.
Yes, they are. I do some group work too, but because people need to be in community with other folks who understand. You don't want to always have to explain yourself. You need to find your people, your tribe, so to speak. But I do such in-depth work with people that a lot of it is one-on-one. And then I send them out after a session for the next week or so to go try something that they've been afraid to do or whatever, something we've talked about. So they always have some homework to try. You don't have to totally succeed. Nobody has to be perfect, but just try it and see how it feels. So yeah, it's an interesting process. And I think the thing that I do that's different is I take them from the point where they can manage emotions pretty well into their new life, actually create that new life, create a roadmap, and actually implement. So I want to know that the person is solidly in their new life and happy. And that's most of the time people don't get taken that far.
What is the goal that someone grieving a loss is working towards? Is it happiness? Is it contentment? Is it balance? Is it emotional regulation? If someone's listening to this and they've just lost or recently lost a loved one, what should they know they should be working towards?
Well, I think the initial thing is the emotions. They are so painful. And we have to learn to regulate those. And, I don't think that the grief ever goes away, but I think that you kind of, in a way, get used to it. It lessens and you carry it in a different way once you're on the other side of that deep, deep pain. But another next, I think, thing that is people want to get rid of is the loneliness. The loneliness is absolutely, I felt physical pain. It was so intense. And I'm a big introvert, believe it or not. I make my living talking, but I'm a big introvert. And, my preference would be just to snuggle down with my dogs and let the world pass me by. But you can't do that if you want out of that space. It's a club nobody wants to be in. Nobody asks to join it. But once you're in it, hopefully you get to the point where you don't want to be in it anymore. You want to get out of it and get out of that space. So I think that loneliness is a second thing that needs to be worked on. And that can be really hard because it can feel so scary to go outside of your house even. That is your safe place for most people. And going out into a crowd, I mean, what if I start crying? I'll embarrass myself. Other people will get all upset. Just all of those things come rushing in on you. So those are two things. And then another one is the loss of identity, because all of a sudden, in a matter of hours, for me, I was no longer a wife after 35 years. So that I identified as a wife. That was, part of who I was. And so I often hear people say, I don't know how to live without him or her, So that identity piece is not dealt with really early because you can't. You're just so confused and there's so much going on that you can't. But that becomes a very important piece. And another one is any kind of vision. You're so inundated with the negative that you have no vision for the future.
Yeah.
and you can't even imagine what the future might be like. So, so those are four of the big things.
What that makes me think of is in family constellation therapy, which is the modality that I facilitate for others. We talk a lot about early deaths and death and the wounds that are left behind emotionally with death and how that carries into different generations. I'm
Yes.
curious if you have thoughts on that and how to navigate generational grief.
Well, generational grief, I believe, is definitely there. And we're not aware of it. So it's just in there kind of dragging us down. And there's societal grief. Most of us, almost all of us, are grieving and aren't even aware of it because of all the changes that have been taking place in our world. We're grieving the loss of who we were 5 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
post COVID. Oh my gosh. I
yeah,
can't even imagine. I mean, life before 2020 seems like it was a different planet than the world we live in now.
exactly. Exactly. And so we maybe aren't consciously grieving that, but there's part of us that's going, it didn't used to be this way. I used to be able to do this or what, so that is, I believe, part of why we are also stressed these days is that we're not aware of and not acknowledging, just like if we, the generational grief. And I think there's some learning to do about that. I also believe there's healers that can help you with that. Not everybody wants to go that direction, but, there's a lot of resources out there and start reading, start studying about it because it's fascinating.
One of the things that I've noticed with generational grief is that many times when it ripples down into different generations, it shows up as shame or it shows up as anger or it shows up as a preconceived notion about a certain group or person or situation or place, and they don't know why. They just know that they have this preconceived anger or frustration or resentment towards, let's just say, men or, and so I like the idea of really looking at grief as this very fluid emotion or experience where you don't put it in a box, because many times grief, it's like a firework. It just explodes and it's got 50 different ways that it can go
Yes.
into.
Yeah.
So I could talk about generational grief forever.
Yeah, I know it. I know it. And it's a reason some people are so volatile and unstable, particularly when something comes out big like this, like, on top of everything and stirs it all up, because we know about compound grief and, it can kill you. You've got to deal with these things or it gets pushed down. It gets turned into a physical issue, psychological issue. And so it's really important that we become aware of it and we try to address it.
I love that. And I want to ask another question that was on the back of my mind too. You said something earlier in the conversation, and my brain's like storing all these questions and making sure I answer them. But you talked about the grief of when you lose a person versus the grief of watching someone you love lose a person. What are the differences, the biggest differences that you see in those two experiences? And is there any crossover in the shared experience that they might be having? Like, for instance, my sister's grief of losing her husband versus me watching my sister lose her husband. We think we're having a somewhat, maybe in a few ways, similar experience because we're both grieving, but really at the end of the day, we're both navigating the grief. Yeah.
Yeah. And yours is compounded by the grief and concern you're feeling for your sister.
Yeah.
Going through this kind of a loss. So on the one hand, you could say you lose your spouse and it's just totally personal, while somebody else is a bit removed because it's not a day-to-day sharing parts of you. There's such a intense and intimate, and I don't mean sexual with that, just intimate coming together of two people that live together for a long time. Yeah. You begin to think like each other. You begin to answer each other's questions. You kind of know what the person's going to do. And that's all ripped away from you, which means part of you is missing. And I don't know, this may sound goofy, but I think that a lot of us are highly impacted by videos, television, movies, and our emotions are stunted around death because, we don't think it's real. It just happened on TV. But there's no emotion that goes with it. So we don't react probably the way they might have 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at tribalism rituals around death. many times death is celebrated, or there's,
Absolutely. It's a
indigenous or ancient.
transition. It's
Yeah.
a milestone.
Yeah, but then we have this modern day experience of death, and even with traumatic deaths that come out of nowhere. Like I said, I felt earlier, we lack that communal society these
Hmm.
days.
We do.
Um yeah, what are the biggest tools that you would recommend to somebody who's going through a loss and grieving that they can do today, like right now? They can walk away from this episode and go, okay, Dr. Lynn said I can go and do this and I'm grieving. What would those things be?
First thing is to take stock, go back through your life and kind of, identify the high points and identify the change points and tell yourself, you know what? I got through that. There's proof that I can do this, so that you strengthen your self assurance a little bit. And then I think you need to reach out to somebody or somebodies who you believe really care about you and have in the past always understood, and say, can we have a cup of coffee? Take that step. Action is very important. And, and if you're worried about how they're going to feel about it, say, I don't want to, I don't want to spend the time talking about what I've been through. I'd really just like to just be together. So, that is important, because you got to find your tribe. You've got to find those people who will support you without trying to fix you, without, saying all sorts of things that really don't mean much of anything, but who can be real with you. So I think that, finding your tribe is an important thing. And then the third thing is you've got to take action, some sort of action. Nobody has, that I know of, has ever been able to move forward or even backward by sitting around thinking, oh, I know they said I ought to do that, but no, you got to take even if it's a tiny step. I don't want to leave my house. Well, I'm going to go out to the mailbox and I'm going to get my mail. That's leaving my house. I've done it. Hooray. Pat my back, and then the next time you venture a little further and venture a little further, so that don't try to do it in big chunks. There's no reason to. And, I always tell people, you don't have to do this alone. If you don't have a mentor to take you by the hand and walk you through this, it's just imperative. Nobody should have to. You don't have to. You can find help, and there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to be superhuman, which is what it takes to do it alone. And sometimes you just get so stuck that you don't know which way to turn.
Beautiful. And my last question is, what advice would you give someone who's watching their loved one grieve the loss of their loved one, meaning us on the outside, who
Yeah.
are trying to figure out what is the right way to grieve and how do we navigate this? And, what would you say to me back in August if I was like, Dr. Lynn, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying, but I'm failing.
Yeah, but you're probably not. Go with your heart. Show the love. If you go in her house and the dishes need to be done, just do them. Don't say anything. Just do them. And let them be, and let them understand that you're willing to just be with them. So there's lots of other little things you can do. Like I mentioned, the kinds of food you might want to bring over. Now, if it's your sister, you'll know better what might be appropriate. Some people, some of the things that I've heard are, some people drop off a bag of groceries. They call it a grief bag. And it's just a little bit of something. And it's not hard to prepare, or you don't have to prepare it at all. And just do that occasionally, so that there's a surprise and a surprise. It's kind of a surprise within a surprise at the front door.
I love that.
Yeah. And some people have received fast food gift certificates, so they don't, nobody wants to cook probably, and nobody's going to go out and eat by themselves at a nice restaurant. So give them a fast food thing that they can all I have to do is drive through. I really don't have to talk to anybody. I can just go get something. So that's another idea. One of my favorite ones for helping to get the family through is I gave everybody like a small mason jar about 3 weeks before my husband's birthday. And I said, think about him in the next 3 weeks. And when you think about something that made you happy, made you giggle, that really struck you as being, wow, write it down and stick it in the jar. And then at his birthday, we sat around, and instead of moaning and groaning, we started pulling those out, and we found ourselves just laughing and adding to the stories. And it was so healthy. It was so healthy.
That's
So, I
awesome.
mean, you could do that at a holiday. You could do it anytime. And
Yeah.
each person had their own, so that, everybody had something specific that they wanted to say.
Well, what I'm hearing you say is that really sometimes it's not always words don't need to be heard. Rather, it's the acts of love that really help
Exactly.
someone feel supported.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, wow, Lynn, this has just been a wonderful conversation. I can't thank you enough for your expertise, your wisdom, and just the love that you've shared through your words to this community. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I loved it. And by the way, I have a little gift that I can send to you, and you can put on the notes so that they can just download it, and it might be a little help to work through some things.
Well, I would love that. Please send that over. And my last question is, where can people connect with you and find you?
Okay, they can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me on Facebook, and I can also give you my calendar link so that you can put that up and people can make an appointment and just have a discovery session.
I love that. And I hope that after people listening to this conversation, they feel just your warmth, that you can really truly like hold someone in their experience. And I think that's largely because you've walked through it yourself.
I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really does.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Lynn. I'm so
Thank you.
grateful.